On behalf of the Center for Career and Professional Development and the Center for International Immigration Services, we wanted to welcome all of you this afternoon to Work Visas Made Easy. We are very, very thankful for Mr. Gluckman to be joining us today. He's been a valued partner of the university for a number of years, and he has provided a number of our students with invaluable advice as you navigate your essentially your career post your graduation here from the university. So he is attorney at law. He specializes in immigration, and he has been, as I mentioned, a wonderful resource to many of our students in the past. And I am confident that many of you will find this presentation to be incredibly informational, educational, not overwhelming, most importantly, comforting. Because I know the process is somewhat overwhelming. So this presentation will hopefully be certainly very helpful in allowing you to kind of navigate your steps post your time here at the university. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be on campus again here. What you didn't mention is that I actually am a native of Fairfield. I went to high school here, and my dad actually graduated from Sacred Heart. So this place is near and dear to my heart, and it's always a pleasure to come here every year to deliver this presentation. Like she was saying, this can be a very overwhelming process, and my goal today is to empower each and every one of you with information that will make it feel less overwhelming, to feel like you're not alone in this process, and you can sort of understand the pathway that you need to navigate between graduation and hopefully permanent residence and U.S. citizenship. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I like to start with sort of a 30,000-foot view of immigration law so you can sort of see where you're situated. There are generally two buckets that we're going to be talking about in immigration law here in the United States. The first bucket is permanent resident green cards. And you're probably thinking, well, stop right there because that's all I really want. And I totally understand it. Green cards are awesome. You can live forever in the United States. You can travel back and forth without having to go to a consulate to get a visa stamp. You can work for whomever you'd like in the United States, or like many Americans, not work at all. So it is a pretty sweet life. But the catch is that very last point there, that bullet there that says that there are only but so many ways to obtain a green card. And oftentimes, especially depending on whether or not you're born in certain countries, it can take many, many years. So out of necessity, we're going to have to dip into that second bucket, those temporary non-immigrant visas. That's probably what most of you guys in this room have right now. We're talking about those alphanumeric categories, F1, J1, H4, okay? There are many, many more than that. It goes from the letter A through the letter V. And if you're ever looking for help sleeping, I highly recommend cracking the Code of Federal Regulations, and I guarantee you'll be sound asleep by the time you get to the letter C or D. I'm not here to put you guys to sleep today, so I'm only going to focus on those categories that are the most relevant to you, those that allow employment, okay? So we're going to talk first about F1 and optional practical training, and then we'll spend a great deal of time talking about the H-1B, which is the most common work visa that folks use. So your typical post-completion employment path. Yay, I graduated Sacred Heart, I got my new degree, what's next? You're typically going to have something called optional practical training after you graduate if you have F1 status. And everybody in the world calls it OPT, okay? And it's going to provide you with a minimum of 12 months of post-graduation work experience. We'll talk about that on the next slide. If you have certain types of STEM degrees, then you can possibly have post-graduation OPT for up to 36 months. So it's a pretty sweet deal. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Or if you have J1, you're going to have something very similar called academic training. And then you're going to transition either from OPT or academic training. You'll transition to the H-1B, which is the most common work visa, which provides 6 years of work eligibility. So OPT, optional practical training. I'm not going to spend too much time on the logistics of applying for OPT, the application forms, the fees, all that stuff. That's all going to be covered in workshops that they deliver here on a regular basis at Sacred Heart. What I'm here to tell you about is the value of OPT. And I don't think I'm overselling it here when I say that next to the degree itself, the next most valuable thing, part of your education here at Sacred Heart, is probably your ability to engage in optional practical training. And you're probably thinking, well, yeah, finally get to make some money after being here so long, and that's part of it. But what's really critical for you to understand about OPT is that it allows you to build relationships with employers. Why is that so key? Because for optional practical training, you do everything yourself. You file the application paperwork yourself, you pay the fee yourself, you show up on day one, ready to work, ready to impress the employer. After that 1 year, then it comes time to talking about what you're going to do in your future. And most, if not all, future visa options require employer sponsorship, okay? So during that year of OPT, you need to spend time building a relationship with the employer, make yourself invaluable, so that by the time it comes to deciding whether or not to sponsor you for some of these future immigration options like H-1B and permanent residency, it's going to be a no-brainer because they're going to know you, they're going to like you, they're going to trust you, they're going to have trained you, and it's going to be something that they're going to easily be willing to do, okay? Now, just a couple of quick things. $410 is the filing fee. Okay, we're going to talk about H-1B fees in a second. This is a bargain, okay? $410 for a year of work authorization in the United States. Billions of people around the world would jump at that deal. You definitely need to take it seriously and get that application filed. Another thing, where you're thinking, well, I don't even have a job lined up. I'm not even sure if I want to stay after graduation. You don't need to have a job lined up in order to apply for OPT. It's just that once the card is issued, you have up to 90 days in which to find a job. Now, what kind of job can you do? Can you bag groceries? Can you pump gas? Not exactly. It's got to be a job that's related to your field of study. So let's say I'm on day 80, I'm on day 85, and I'm freaking out. I still don't have a job offer. What do? I generally recommend that folks contact their major advisor, see if there's a research project in a field that's related to what you majored in, and do on a volunteer basis some research work in that area. That will stop the unemployment clock from ticking and allow you that additional time in which to find a paying job, okay? And then one final thing is, you guys have been here long enough, and you know our government is hopeless. They're slow on almost everything. So do you want to wait until the last second before applying for OPT? No, you want to apply as early as you can. You can apply up to 90 days before your graduation. I recommend you do so. You can schedule a later start date on your card to accommodate whether or not you might have a delay in finding a job after graduation. But the last thing you want to do is to apply on the very last day of your eligibility, which is 60 days after your graduation, and be waiting and waiting and waiting for the card, and every day you have to keep delaying the start date of your dream job. You definitely don't want to be in that position. Apply as early as you can. STEM extensions. So, remember, I talked about what a bargain $410 is for 1 year. Think about this, $410 for an additional 2 years of OPT. So we're talking about 3 years of post-graduation work eligibility, okay? That is a huge deal. Now, how do I know if I qualify for this STEM extension? Okay, it's got to be a science, technology, engineering, and mathematics degree. But like many things in your college careers, you'll find that Google is also your friend here as well. You just Google Department of Homeland Security STEM degree list. It'll have a PDF document that lists every single major field that's going to qualify for a STEM extension. And if one of the codes on that list matches the code that's on the I-20 form that you get from the International Students Office, voila, you qualify for a STEM extension, which allows you up to 3 years of post-graduation work authorization. A couple differences between your first year of OPT and the STEM extension. First is you actually do have to have a job lined up to qualify for a STEM extension, and it's got to be a job with an employer that's enrolled in something called E-Verify, okay? E-Verify is a national web-based employment verification database that you'll find nowadays most employers are already enrolled in, especially if they do any kind of work with the federal government. But if the employer is not enrolled in E-Verify, they can do so pretty easily online, even if it's just for the purpose of being able to hire you on STEM OPT, okay? So it's definitely not something to panic about if they're not enrolled in E-Verify. And the second thing is, remember I talked about for your first OPT card, you can apply up to 60 days after graduation. That's called a grace period. There is no grace period for filing the STEM extension. Your extension paperwork has to be received by immigration, by USCIS, before your first year card expires. No exceptions. Every single year, I have people come up to me and be like, I just missed my deadline by 1 day. Surely they're going to forgive me. And my answer in almost every single circumstance is that they're not going to forgive you. And it's very unforgiving, and it's a deadline you need to be aware of because, again, we're talking about 2 years of post-graduation work authorization. You want to take this seriously and get this in on time. And if you can apply as early as you can, you should do that, okay? And then the final thing is that unlike the first year of OPT, where they essentially let you run wild out there with no training plan, for some reason to qualify for this additional 2 years of OPT, you have to come up with a training plan with your employer. You sit down with the employer and complete it with some details about what goals you're going to be reaching, how you're going to be supervised at each phase, and you turn that into the International Students Office. So the reason I'm mentioning that training plan and the E-Verify is that you build in enough time before your first year card expires to ask HR about E-Verify, to sit down with the employer, complete the I-983 training plan, to get that paperwork turned into your office here at Sacred Heart, to get the paperwork you need to apply. Okay, so plan for that. But again, the payoff is huge. It's an additional 2 years to build those relationships with employers, and it'll make the transition to the next phase that I'm going to be talking about in my coming slides to be much smoother. Okay. I'm going to move on to the H-1B, but does anybody have any questions about F1, OPT, anything like that before I proceed? Yes? Right, yeah. So it's 2 different applications. So you apply preferably before you graduate for the first year of OPT. And then before the end of that, before your card expires, you'll apply again for the STEM OPT. And again, they have workshops here on campus that I highly recommend you folks attend. Yes? Well, for OPT, it's got to be related to the degree that you just received. Okay. All right. Yes?
So you said we can apply after finishing 30 days prior to our finishing date.
Up to 90 days prior, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But in that is considered as 90 days of unemployment?
No, the 90 days of unemployment, that clock does not start ticking until the start date on your card, okay? So let's say I apply 90 days before graduation, so let's say I apply in February, and I ask for a June start date, okay? The card's going to be issued with a start date of, let's say, June 1st. June 1st is when that clock starts, even if the application was approved months earlier, okay? Mm-hmm. Here we go, the pièce de résistance, the H-1B visa. This is a particularly relevant category now, given the time of year that we're in, and you'll understand that in a second. But this is what a lot of folks want to know about, because there's not very much information out there, and what information is out there is extremely unclear and full of myths. Okay, so what I want you guys to understand is the real nature of the H-1B, what employers need to know, and more importantly, how you need to explain things to employers. And before I proceed further, I want to point out the first of several of my handouts. It's the one-page sheet that is called Easy Guide to Hiring Foreign Graduates. Okay, I think all of my handouts are very valuable, but I think this one's probably the most valuable. And the idea behind this is that while I would love to accompany each and every one of you to your job interviews, I simply can't do that. But what I can provide you is, on one page, distilled wisdom about the entire process so that you can learn it and you can articulate it and answer questions for employers about how much it costs, when it has to happen, and what they need to do. And at the very bottom, it's got my contact information in case the employers have any questions. Because every year, employers might have seen something on 60 Minutes or read something online that makes them question whether or not they want to sponsor you, because you already have built that relationship and they want to sponsor you, but they're questioning the process. Put them in contact with me. I can answer their questions free of charge in 5 minutes. And more often than not, I've been able to get them off the fence and willing to sponsor for H-1B. Okay? So again, learn it, laminate it, love it, and be able to explain it. Because at the end of the day, you guys have to be your own best advocates, and I recommend that as an excellent starting point. So we'll talk a little bit about the H-1B right now. So we'll start with some general concepts. I guess it's good to compare and contrast it with OPT, since we just talked about OPT. So remember, OPT, you do everything yourself, you file the paperwork yourself, you pay for it yourself. H-1B is the absolute opposite. The H-1B requires an employer to sponsor you, meaning they're the ones who are driving the boat. They're the ones who are filing the paperwork. They're the ones who are paying the fees. Okay? What are they sponsoring you for? They're sponsoring you for a job that requires at least a bachelor's degree in a specific field. You obviously have to have that degree, and the degree's got to relate to the job. All right? So, and one other thing that's not on here that people ask about all the time is that the employer has to be willing to pay you at least the prevailing wage for the type of job you're going to be doing in the geographic location where you're going to be doing it. So obviously the wage in New York City is going to be a lot higher than if you were going to be working in Iowa, okay? But that's just, those are the general concepts of the H-1B. And again, if they like you and they've built a relationship with you, that's rarely going to be an issue. That last bullet about the advertising for U.S. workers, I put that on there because that's one of those misconceptions that employers always seem to be asking about. They're like, geez, I really want to hire you, but I don't want to have to go out there and advertise the position. You know, it's going to be a huge pain in the neck. They don't have to do that. If they want to hire you, they can hire you. No need to show that there aren't any U.S. workers available. They just need to agree to pay you at least that prevailing wage, okay? So it's all covered on that Easy Guide to Hiring Foreign Graduates sheet. A little more detail about the H-1B. So what are the mechanics of it? So they file a petition. It's going to be approved. How long is it going to be approved for? A 3-year period. And then you can have a 3-year extension after that, generally a 6-year maximum. There are some ways to extend it beyond that 6 years, but that all relates to green card processing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about green cards. Scope of H-1B authorization. Oh, happy day. I got my H-1B approval. I've downed a couple of buckets of champagne. My head's hurting a little bit, and now I'm starting to think, what does it actually mean that I have H-1B status? What does it allow me to do? And it's actually relatively narrow in scope. It only allows you to work for the employer that sponsored you, doing what they said you were going to be doing in the location where they said you were going to be doing it, okay? So it doesn't allow you to moonlight as an Uber driver after hours. It doesn't allow you to write and market the great American novel in your spare time. No, it only allows you to do the job you were sponsored to do. That doesn't mean that you can't do any other jobs. The key is that you just have to have that other employer. If you want to work in another job, that has to be covered by its own H-1B petition. Okay? That's called concurrent H-1B employment. So let's say you have 2 part-time jobs, totally allowable on H-1B. Even if you're only doing 1 part-time job, that's allowable on H-1B. I've done H-1Bs for as little as 5 to 10 hours a week. Okay? So that's not a limitation either. And especially if there's a wage issue, if they can't pay the wage, a way to accommodate that is maybe by filing it for a part-time position. Okay? Now, you have your H-1B, you're working, and all of a sudden you get a better job offer. And you're thinking, oh, man, too bad I'm stuck with this employer because they filed my petition. I can't possibly take that job. And the answer is you certainly can. In fact, it's much easier to be able to transition to a new job once you have H-1B status. It's called H-1B portability, okay? And the way it works is that if you're working for employer A and you want to work for employer B, then employer B will file a petition to transfer your H-1B status from employer A to employer B, and you can start working for the new employer as soon as that new petition is filed. You don't have to wait the many, many months it might take for the government to finally get around to approving the case. That's a really big benefit because then you don't have to worry about paying an exorbitant fee for premium processing on top of the fee that they already have to pay. Okay? So it's a really nice benefit of having H-1B status. Now, sticker shock slide. Remember, I was talking about how cheap the OPT was, $410, bargain, okay? Yes, it was a bargain, and now you understand why, because these are the fees that go into the H-1B process. The first question is, who pays them? Can I pay them as the student? Can I just say, hey, you know what, if you file this paperwork, I'll pay everything? No, unfortunately, you cannot. Federal law requires the employer to pay all these fees, including if there's an attorney involved, okay? So they have to pay both the legal fees and the filing fees, and there are various filing fees layered on here. The last couple, the premium processing is optional, and the last one is very rare. That's only for employers that rely on H-1B and L-1 workers, and chances are, if they're so reliant on it, that's part of their business model, and they're very comfortable with paying these fees, okay? So you're probably thinking, well, you know, I might as well get up right now and walk out because there's no way on God's green earth I'm going to get an employer to pay these fees. And again, I'm telling you, it goes back to OPT. If you have built that relationship with an employer, they're going to have no problem paying these fees. I can tell you from an employer's perspective, if I had an employee that I've already known for over a year, that somebody I trust, somebody I've trained, they do things the way I like them, they are making money for me, then it's going to be much more valuable for me to keep that person on staff and pay these fees than to lay them off, try to find somebody that is maybe even half as skilled as you guys, then spend the additional time training them, getting them up to speed, and have to wait a whole other year before they even get to maybe close to the level you were before I laid you off. No, I don't want to deal with that stuff. I'll pay these fees. It's going to be easier, and it's much more palatable to do not give up, okay? So again, build that relationship with the employer, and the best evidence of the demand for these H-1Bs is the fact that every single year there's a lottery, because there's far more demand for H-1Bs than there is supply. And we'll talk about the mechanics of the lottery in a second, but again, just focus on step by step, building that relationship, and then the H-1B will come because the employer is going to be willing to pay these fees because they don't want to lose a valuable employee. So, before I get into the H-1B lottery and the quotas, does anybody have any general questions about the H-1B category? And I will, just by way of preview, I'm going to stick around afterwards. If anyone has any questions, you can come up and ask me. And obviously, I'm going to take questions at the end as well. So, don't feel like you have to ask everything now. There's going to be plenty of time for that. Yes, you had a question in the back.
Can we take break in H-1B? Like, after 3 years, we can take a break of year and a half for a student visa. And do we have to resume the previous H-1 or we can go for a new H-1 after a break?
Yeah, so the question is, well, do I have to use the 6 years in H-1B? Can I take a break? And the answer is, yeah, you certainly can. I mean, if you want to, let's say after the first 3 years of H-1B, you get into graduate school and you want to do that, then you can change your status from H-1B to F-1 and go back and do that. And then if you had been counted in this quota we're going to talk about in a second, then after you graduate, you can maybe get OPT again, and then you can go back to H-1B. And it doesn't have to be with the same employer, okay? So it gives you a lot of flexibility to do that, yeah.
So we can go for a new one after graduation?
Yeah, sure. All right, so we're going to talk about the really exciting stuff, but it's actually really relevant right now in this time of the year, H-1B quotas and calendars, okay? Everybody in this room, your year starts on January 1st and ends on December 31st. Well, guess what? That makes far too much sense for the U.S. government. Now, they have to have something they call a fiscal year, and their fiscal year starts on October 1st and it ends on September 30th. And you're probably thinking, well, why the heck do I care what the U.S. government calls its year? Well, the reason you need to care is because the first day of every fiscal year, so every October 1st, is when they release a new quota of H-1Bs. So what is this quota made up of? It's 85,000 new H-1Bs that become available. And we're not talking about the hundreds of thousands of people who already have H-1Bs and who are maybe extending or changing employers. No, not those folks. It's folks like you, first-time H-1B holders, people coming from F-1, from OPT. It's 85,000 that are available. So what is that quota made up of? There's a 20,000 set aside for folks who have master's or higher degrees from U.S. institutions. So if you're getting your master's degree from Sacred Heart, you get an additional 20,000 that's available. You have access to that. And then other 65 are for everybody else. So people who have bachelor's degrees in the U.S. or who have degrees from overseas, okay? So how does it work if there's a lottery and I have a master's or higher degree from Sacred Heart? Well, I get to participate, lucky me, in up to 2 lotteries, okay? First, I get to participate in the 65,000 lottery, so for everybody. And if I'm picked, great. If I'm not, then I get to participate in a second lottery just for the 20,000, just for folks like me who have those master's or higher degrees from the U.S. institution. So it really increases the value of your master's or higher degree in the U.S. I think they've done some calculations that said that it increases your chance of being selected in the lottery by about 10 to 15%. So, not a huge amount, but definitely something that is significant. Now, current availability, I'm going to get to that in a second. There aren't any, so you can't really file an H-1B right now. But coming up in a couple of weeks is the H-1B registration period, okay? And I want to stop for a second and just let you guys know that our government and our system stinks, okay? It's not merit-based. It is all random. It is a completely random lottery, all right? So you have to be able to control the things that are within your grasp, okay? You can't control whether or not you are picked in the lottery, but what you can control is whether you understand the timeline, okay, of when to get in the lottery and to when to get an employer on board to get your submission in to be considered, okay? Because I could be a 4.0 PhD from Harvard. I'm busy curing cancer. I have no idea what these timelines are. I don't talk to the employer. I don't get my registration. I have a 0% chance of getting selected. Whereas if I'm a 2.0 grad student from Steubenville State University, I actually understand this calendar. I get the employer on board in time. I got my registration submitted. I've got an infinitely better chance than the Harvard guy, okay? Don't be the Harvard guy. Understand this calendar. Understand the things that are within your control and grab control of them, okay? So again, October 1st is when the new quota is released, and by now you're thinking, man, I really want an H-1B. how soon can I get one? How do I go through that process? Well, the answer is, look at that. March 1st to the 17th is the annual electronic registration period for the H-1B lottery, okay? So we're just in a couple weeks. And the way that works is that an employer, between those dates, will go into the USCIS, which is the Immigration Services online portal. They'll put in some basic information about themselves, some basic information about you, and they'll submit that registration into the lottery. And then the government, after that period closes, will conduct a lottery on those electronic registrations. And by the end of March, they will notify the employer whether or not your registration has been selected. And if your registration has been selected, the employer then has a full 90-day period in which to file the full-blown H-1B paperwork. And that's really important because to submit an electronic registration right now, you saw on the previous slide, is only $10, okay? So it's really very little buy-in for the employer, okay? The only time they're actually going to have to spend all that money on a lawyer and on filing fees and all that is when they already know that your case has been selected in the lottery and that it's going to be submitted and considered on the merits. This is way better than in years past, okay? Prior to 2020, when they introduced this electronic system, the employer had to pay the lawyer the full amount, have the full filing fees ready, send a paper filing to these immigration service centers, and then just wait and wait and wait 2, 3, 4, 5 months before they find out whether or not your case has been selected in the lottery. And that's a lot more buy-in for the employer as well, because they got to shell out all those funds, and they're not even sure that the case is even ultimately going to get picked in the lottery. Here's a much better system, $10 to get them in and to get the registration submitted, and only then, within that 90-day period, do they have to file that full-blown H-1B paperwork. All right, so it's really much easier to get an employer on board. Now, when do I typically recommend that folks talk to employers about the H-1B process? I generally say after people come back from the holidays, and January is a good time to get them on board. But if you're thinking about doing it this year in this year's lottery, you better talk to them now, because now is the time to get those registrations ready so that you can have them drop by the time that March 17th at noon closing date, okay? So it really is, it's coming up, but it's a lot less buy-in. It's a relatively simple process to get those employers on board. It also works out pretty well with the academic calendar. Now, remember I told you they used to have to send these paper filings in on April 1st, and your qualifications for the H-1B were locked in as of the date that it was filed, so April 1st. So if you were working on a degree that you weren't going to get until May, guess what? That doesn't count. If you were working on a master's degree that was going to allow you to participate in that additional 20,000 lottery, guess what? That doesn't count. That totally changes with this lottery, with the electronic registration. Because with that 90-day filing window that opens up after the lottery results are announced at the end of March, that's going to take you through the end of June to submit the full-blown H-1B petition. What happens between March and June? You graduate. And once you graduate, you can submit that full-blown H-1B paperwork with your degree, and that qualifies you both for that additional lottery if you happen to be completing a master's degree, and it also allows you to use that newly minted degree to qualify for the job you're being sponsored for. So it works a lot better with that academic calendar. It's a much better system, less buy-in. Just make sure that you understand that it's coming up in March and get the employer on board in time. So I've been yammering a lot about these calendars, and I think it's easier to understand how things work through specific examples. At least that's how I learned best, okay? So example 1, this is my dream world. This is a dream world where, you already, before you even graduate, you've got an employer lined up, and look, they've submitted a registration for you in the lottery, and my gosh, you were selected. The employer then, within that 90-day filing window, is going to submit the H-1B paperwork, and it's going to take effect on October 1st of 2023, which is when that new quota of H-1Bs opens up. And of course, you will have listened to me, you will have gotten OPT, and you'll work through September 30th on your OPT, and you'll wake up on October 1st holding bright, shiny new H-1B status, ready to take on your American dream. Okay? Really easy, right? Well, unfortunately, for 99.9% of you guys, this is what's going to happen. All right? Example 2. You graduate in May, and either you don't have an H-1B employer lined up, or they submitted a registration and it wasn't selected. That's fine, because you will have listened to me, and you will have gotten OPT, and you'll work until next March when the next lottery electronic registration period opens up. And this time, lo and behold, you're selected. The employer is then, within that 90-day period, going to send in the full petition paperwork, and your H-1B is going to be taking effect on October 1st of 2024. So next year, the first day of that fiscal year. But oh my gosh, I knew I was missing something. My OPT is only valid for 1 year, and it's going to expire in June. So if my OPT expires in June, but my H-1B can't take effect until October 1st, then what the heck do I do in July, August, and September? Do I have to stop working? Do I have to go home? Am I going to get deported? Oh my gosh, relax. There's something that is designed especially for folks in that position. It is called cap gap relief. And that gives you relief to plug that gap that is caused by the H-1B cap. So the way that it works is that if you have OPT and it's valid at the time that the employer files that full petition paperwork, so within that 90-day period, and your OPT is still valid, then your OPT is automatically going to be extended until September 30th to plug that gap that is caused by the H-1B cap. So an example 2, you'll see my OPT was valid until June of 2024. Employer filed my petition paperwork in April. So my OPT was still valid at that time. Therefore, it's going to automatically be extended until September 30th. And just like in example 1, I'll work on OPT through September 30th, and I'll wake up on October 1st with my bright, shiny new H-1B status. Okay? So H-1B cap gap is an extremely valuable benefit, but again, it requires the employer to file that paperwork before your OPT card expires. So make sure that you stay on top of that. So I've been spending a lot of time talking about the quota and the cap, but it's really important for you guys to know that not all employers are subject to that quota. They're on this slide right here. These employers right here, and they're all covered on my multi-page handout. It says H-1B cap exemptions and alternatives. They don't have to play that March, October dance at all. They can file for you whenever the heck they want. So what's the largest category of cap-exempt organizations? You're sitting in one right now, universities. If you are looking at a career in academia, you very well may never encounter the H-1B cap, okay? It's a really valuable recruiting tool for them. But if it does limit your career mobility. So if I want to go from academia into the private sector, then yes, I do have to worry about getting a cap number. So just think about that. But it is pretty awesome because long after that lottery is over and long after folks are recovering from the depression about not being selected, they can file for you on graduation day. They can file for you in August. They can file for you in September. Long after that, they're not limited to that calendar, all right? And it's very important for you guys to understand that it goes by who your employer is, the cap exemption, not the work you're going to be doing. So let's say I work for Sacred Heart, and I work in IT. I have nothing to do with academics, nothing to do with research, no teaching, nothing. I'm just crawling around under computers all day. I'm still cap exempt because my employer is Sacred Heart, which is a university. So it's really important to understand that. The second bullet is nonprofit organizations that are affiliated with universities. A lot of people think that all nonprofits are exempt. I mean, I wish that was the case, but it's unfortunately not. It's just the types of nonprofits that are listed here. But it's not as narrow as you might think. I mean, you've got the obvious examples where, you know, you've got a school that owns a nonprofit, like let's say Harvard Medical School, or if Sacred Heart owns a research laboratory. Those are easy ones. But they can be surprising as well because, for example, all New York State public school positions are exempt from the cap under the second bullet point. Why is that? Because ultimately the New York State education system is owned and controlled by the New York State University Board of Regents. So that university cap exemption flows down to each individual school, making positions at those schools cap exempt. Okay? So the reason I'm saying that is that don't give up hope. I mean, if you think that a particular employer that you're considering might be exempt from the cap, then you can shoot me an email with some basic information about the employer, maybe a link to their website, and I can let you know whether or not I think you have a good cap exemption argument. Okay? And I never charge for that kind of stuff. So it's broader than you might think. And the last couple are pretty basic, straightforward. I mean, you've got your think tanks, and then you've got your government research organizations, federal, state, or local. So if the town of Fairfield has a Department of Economic Analysis, guess what? That can qualify as a government research organization because it's a local government entity. Okay? Now, this is my sad slide. Okay? And it's, you guys have done everything right. You built that relationship with the employer on OPT. You understood the calendar. You got the employer on board. You got that registration in, and you weren't selected, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I guess my life and my career in the United States is over, and I'm here to tell you, not so fast. There are lots of alternatives to the H-1B that might not be as good as the H-1B, but they're at the very least able to keep you here, living and working until perhaps you can try the lottery the following year. And those are also covered in that multi-page handout that says H-1B cap exemptions and alternatives. So the first bullet is nationality specific. If you have a passport from one of these countries, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, or Australia, there is a work visa category that is very similar in terms of eligibility to the H-1B, but that either does not have any caps at all or that has caps that are never reached. So if you have a passport from one of those countries, you don't have to have been born in one of those countries, just a passport, then this is an excellent alternative visa option for you. The L1 is another good option. It's for folks who have prior work experience outside the United States within a particular corporate organization. Let's say you come over here for like a 1 or 2 year MBA, and then the folks from that organization want you to work at the U.S. branch, affiliate, or subsidiary. Then the L1 is an excellent option for that. It can provide up to 7 years of work eligibility. The E-visa is one that I get questions about all the time, because many folks in this room, you have entrepreneurial instincts. You want to start a business. You want to be the next Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. It's great, except that our immigration system stinks in terms of not making very many options available. The E-treaty option is pretty much the only visa that's going to allow for pure entrepreneurship. And the way it works is that if you have a passport, again, you don't have to be born, you just have to have a passport from one of the countries with whom the United States has a qualifying treaty, and they're all listed on the last page of that document, then you can make a substantial investment in either starting up your business or buying a business, and that will allow you to remain in the United States, basically in perpetuity to run that business. There's no durational maximum for E2 status like there is for H's and L's, okay? It's an excellent option if you are looking for an entrepreneurial pathway. It's complicated in terms of applying, and it doesn't apply to every country. I wish we had treaties, for example, with India, China, Brazil, and Russia, but if you do have a passport from one of those other countries that are listed, then it's an excellent option to explore. And the last couple are pretty straightforward. I mean, you can always re-enroll in full-time studies. So let's say I have my bachelor's degree, I do my OPT, I don't get selected, well, it's master's time, and then I get my set of OPT on that level, and then it's PhD time. So that's something you can do. But there are lots of other options that you might not be aware of. I mean, the last thing you want to do after having invested so much time and money studying the United States is to leave, and in your childhood bedroom you find out about this visa category that you totally could have qualified for, but you didn't apply for before you leave the United States. So you don't want to be in that situation. If you find yourself shut out of the H-1B process and grasping for options to remain here, then you can always send me a copy of your resume. We'll schedule a time to look it over, and I'll see if there are other options that might be available to you. You owe it to yourselves after having spent so much time and money here, and I don't charge for those types of consultations. Now, the last alternative I want to talk about gets 2 slides of its own, and this is also listed on the blue handout, which goes over some of these visa categories. This is the O1 visa for folks who have extraordinary ability. This is a nice alternative to the H-1B for 2 reasons. First, it allows you to pay the filing fees, so you don't have to have the employer. So if the employer's like, I'm not paying these filing fees, the O1 is an option. You can pay those fees, okay? And it also allows you, unlike the H-1B, to file up to 1 year in advance. So you can have an O1 in place well before you even have to worry about the H-1B lottery. Or conversely, if you're not selecting the lottery, you can turn around and try to file an O1, okay? But it's not available for just anybody. You've got to be in a small percentage at the top of your field. And, you know, it's one of those things where you're going to want to use an attorney because even something as simple seeming as defining your field is very complex, because that's a strategic call. If you say, I'm the best biologist, well, how many biologists are there? You know, there are millions of them, you know. But if I make it a very specific type of biologist, microbiologist, these types of microorganisms, blah, blah, that's a smaller denominator, easier to rise to the top of your field, okay? How do I show I qualify for this? Well, you either have to have a major international award, like a Nobel Prize. Any Nobel Prize winners in here today? No, not yet, though. Maybe soon. Or you have to meet 3 of the 8 specific criteria that are listed on that, and then I reproduced right here on this slide. So nothing's going to be particularly surprising. You know, somebody who has lots of publications, somebody who has making a lot of money, if you're mentioned in a lot of media, you know, just these are the hallmarks of somebody who's risen to the very top of their field, okay? And it's a very case-by-case type of thing. Some people work in a field where you would be expected to have a lot of publications. Other people work in fields, or even artists who don't have very many publications or have completely different ways to show extraordinary ability. So because it's so case-by-case, I always recommend folks that think they might qualify for the O1, just send me a copy of your resume, and then we can go over it. So we can speak about the very facts and circumstances of your case, and we don't charge for those types of reviews, okay? So that's it for these non-immigrant visas. I'm going to talk about green cards in a second, but I'm going to pause to see if anybody had any remaining questions about the H-1B or any of these other visa categories that I've been talking about. You got a question? Yes.
If I graduate in June,
Yeah.
so when should I basically file for H1 in this year or the next year?
Well, I mean, this is a very good question. So the question is, if I'm graduating this year, when should I file for H-1B? Well, the answer is, do you do better with one lottery ticket, or are you better with 3 lottery tickets? You want to try to play the lottery as many times as you can. So let's say you're somebody who has STEM OPT, right? So you have your 1 year of OPT, then you have your next 2. So that's 3 years total. If you have an employer that's on board with you in the very first year and they're willing to sponsor you for H-1B, then you're going to want to try that lottery every single year, because the last thing you want to do is wait until the very last year you're eligible and then play the lottery that year. If you lose, then you're out of luck, whereas if you've played it every single year. So to answer your question, as early as you possibly can get an employer on board who's willing to submit a registration lottery, I always recommend doing it, because the more chances you play, the more chances you have to win. Green cards, okay? Again, this is what everybody wants. This is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, okay? And I have a couple handouts to go over this. So again, limited ways to obtain. Remember, that goes back to my second slide here. Family relationships can provide a basis for a green card. And those are all laid out on that yellow sheet. The most obvious is if you're here at Sacred Heart and you meet the man or woman of your dreams, and that person just so happens to be a U.S. citizen, then you can get a green card in a relatively quick fashion by filing the paperwork with immigration. That's not to say that the paperwork is easy. You're probably going to want to use an attorney for that, and we do those types of cases all the time, but the pathway is very straightforward. Conversely, there are some other relationships that you think are probably more worthwhile than they really are. So if you're sitting here saying, well, my brother's a U.S. citizen, I don't even know why I'm here today because he's just going to file for me and I'm all set. Well, guess what? That's not going to be a solution for most of you, because it's going to take 15 to 20 years to get through the backlog in that category. And often it's going to be more trouble than it's worth. And in almost every circumstance, you're going to get a green card faster through these employment and special skills categories I'm going to talk about in a second. Okay? So, spousal sponsorship, right to the end. Some of these more remote relationships, it's going to take a lot longer, okay? Diversity visa lottery. So I mentioned this because it's a pathway to a green card. Every single year, the government puts out some countries that can participate in the diversity visa lottery based on having been historically underrepresented in our immigration flows. So spoiler alert, India and China and Brazil and Russia are never going to be on there, okay? But if you're from a country, it's going to be a Western European country, it can be lots of African countries around there, then you can submit your entry into the diversity visa lottery. If you get picked, great. You can hopefully get your green card that way. If not, it's not going to affect your F1 status just because it's so remote that you're going to actually be selected. You really are. It really is a lottery. I mean, we're talking about 50,000 slots and about 20 million entries. So your chances of being selected are pretty slim. But, every year I have a couple people that come up to me and say they've been selected. But the lesson is that you don't want to make that the centerpiece to your immigration plan, because it's generally not going to pan out. Instead, you're going to want to think about these employment or special skills categories I'm going to talk about in a second. Now, they come in different preference categories. And unfortunately, like I said, our immigration system is very antiquated, and it's built on quotas. Now, our quotas and your access to a quota number is determined by which preference category you fall into. Okay? EB1 is the highest preference category. So theoretically, you've got the lowest wait time. Okay? If you're not from China or India, there are no wait times in any of these categories right now. Okay? But if you're from China or India, it's going to be a difference between waiting maybe a year for the EB1 versus maybe 15, 20, or even 30 years or more in the EB3 category. So it really does make a difference. And I'll talk about the various options of these categories in a second. But it's really important that you understand that last bullet point, is that it's not enough for you to start the green card process. You can't just crack your knuckles and put your feet up on the desk. If you want to remain in the United States while you're going through the green card process, you have to maintain a valid non-immigrant status. Remember those alphanumeric statuses. You've got to have that to remain in the United States, which takes me back to my point earlier about the H-1B. Remember, I said there's a 6-year maximum, but you can extend it beyond 6 years in certain circumstances related to the green card filing. Well, this is it. So if you have, for example, worked in a position during your 6 years and you went home, let's say, every summer for 2 months. Say I'm a professor, every year I go home for 2 months. I can recapture that time and effectively add it back onto my H-1B. So if I go home 2 months times 6 years, that's effectively an additional year I can tack on into recapture and effectively get a 7th year of H-1B. But for most folks, that's not going to be enough. If you're relying on that, you either have to have an employment-based green card process pending for at least a year that will allow you to extend beyond the 6 years in 1 year increments. And if you are from India or China and you're caught in that backlog, but you've done everything you can, you've gotten the approved I-140, and you're just waiting for your priority date to be current, so for you to get to the front of the line, then you can keep extending your green card, your H-1B in 3-year increments, okay? But note, it's only for employment-based green card processes. So to go back, I don't want to pick on the person who's relying on their brother's or sister's sponsorship, but that's not going to help. It's got to be an employment-based process that allows you to extend beyond 6 years, not a family-based process. So let's talk about some of these categories here. EB1, so this is the first preference category. So we really, really, really want these folks. That's why we're putting you guys to the front of the line. You get first access to these quota numbers. So this EB1A is for people of extraordinary ability. What a broad term that is. What's very attractive about this category is that first bullet. It's self-sponsored. You don't need an employer sponsor. You don't even need to have a job offer. But again, it's going to be very similar to that O1 visa, where you got to show that you're risen to the top of your field, and you got to either have a major international award or meet at least 3 of those requirements. Okay, and that's all laid out on the green sheet. And it's also noteworthy to realize that just ticking 3 of these boxes is not going to be enough. The government is going to conduct what they call their own merits analysis to see, okay, yes, you met these 3 factors, but are you really somebody of extraordinary ability? Have you really risen to the very top of your field? And that's where it's really important to partner with an attorney to put together a really good story about why you're so extraordinary, and make it understandable to the adjudicator. Because I don't want to be down on these immigration adjudicators, but a lot of them don't even have bachelor's degrees. So if you're trying to explain particle physics and chaos theory and string theory to these folks who might only have a high school degree, that's not going to work. You've got to be able to speak them in language they understand, while at the same time not dumbing down and diminishing your contribution. So it really is a difficult needle to thread, but you're going to want to use somebody who has experience in that area. If you guys think you might qualify for EB1A or any of these other categories, feel free to send me a copy of your detailed CV or resume, and we'll give you a frank assessment about whether or not we think you have some good prospects in that category. And again, it's case by case. So people are like, how many publications do I have? I don't know. I don't know what your field is. So send me your resume. I'll give you your specific information about you. Yes, question? No, an NIW is something different. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's an EB2 cap. All right, so EB1. So we're still in the first preference category. So we really, really want you, but this is an EB1B for outstanding researchers or professors. So this one, unlike EB1A, this one is employer sponsored, and you got to either be sponsored by an academic institution for a full-time, a permanent position, or you can be sponsored by a private institution as long as they have at least 3 researchers on staff. And you got to have at least 3 years of teaching or research experience. You can use experience you used prior to graduating to qualify for that. And then you only have to meet 2 factors instead of the 3. And that's all laid out on that green sheet. Again, if you think you might qualify, shoot me your resume, we'll take a look. Now we're into EB2. So National Interest Waiver, the NIW you're just asking about, that is a very attractive option to a lot of folks, especially folks who are not from China or India, because it's not a backlogged category right now, okay? This is self-sponsored as well, which is why it's so attractive. You don't have to have a job offer. It's relatively easy to meet the factors. You either have to have a U.S. advanced degree. Okay, many people who have master's degrees from Sacred Heart, you're automatically going to qualify for consideration, or you can meet these 3 factors. But the key and what ensnares a lot of people is that you have to make the required showing that it would be harmful to the national interest of the United States to force you guys to go through the ordinary green card process. That you are in such a great position, you have such wonderful accomplishments that you're going to be achieving all this great stuff, and if we force you to go through the regular process, it's going to derail all that and we're going to lose out. So it's, again, really important to be able to work with somebody who can tell a story that explains exactly why the waiver and the national interest waiver should apply to you. Again, if you think you might qualify, send me your resume. And then the last, and this is what we're asking people to get waived from when you're doing the national interest waiver process, is the PERM labor certification. And that's what the vast majority of folks are ultimately going to have to go through to get the green card. And there's no shame in it. It's just the reality of the situation, okay? And it's a very, very dry process that is completely process-driven. And it's stupid, but we have to go through it, okay? So it's going to be either in the EB2 category, okay, second preference, or the EB3 category. For most people, that's not going to make a difference because there are no backlogs in either the EB2 or EB3 category unless you're from China or India. And it's going to depend on the requirements for the position. So if I'm being sponsored for a job that requires at least a master's degree or requires at least a bachelor's degree and 5 years of experience, then I'm going to be in the EB2 category. If it's going to require less than that, I'll be in the EB3 category. This is employer-sponsored. It's got to be for a permanent full-time position. And it's just so, it's laughable what they make the employers go through for these. You got to show there are no U.S. workers available for the position. But to do that, they make the employer post 2 Sunday ads, because I'm sure everybody here is looking at the Sunday paper for job offerings, right? No, nobody looks at that. They make you go into put some entries into the job bank for the state, which nobody looks at unless you're trying to renew your unemployment. So really, they make the employer go through these stupid steps, but it's actually to your benefit because they're forcing the employer to apply places where nobody's looking. So it's easier to show that there are no qualifying U.S. workers because nobody's actually going to respond. So you go through that process, and then you can proceed with the green card after you've been able to get that certification that there are no qualified, willing, and available U.S. workers. There's a similar and separate process for folks who are being sponsored for teaching positions at institutes of higher education. And that's where they can even say, okay, even if these other U.S. workers applied, we like you better, so we can sponsor you, okay? But generally, if there's a U.S. worker that qualifies in the PERM process who applies, then that process needs to be restarted because they are not able to make that required showing. But in reality, I found it very rare that anybody even ever applies for these positions. So the PERM is relatively simple and straightforward to go through. But again, it's lots of steps, and if you mess up one, then the whole process is totally blows up in your face. So you're going to need an attorney for that one too. So harping on that theme, choosing an attorney. Again, I've gone through a lot of stuff today, and it's a lot of stuff to digest, and a lot of you might be feeling overwhelmed, but it's important to understand that you don't need to go through this process alone. You can join forces with an attorney who's experienced. It doesn't matter where that attorney is. Everything is federal law, so the immigration laws in Connecticut are the same as they are in Guam, Puerto Rico, Wyoming, anywhere, okay? Especially in this era of Zoom. What is really important is that this person that you're going to be working with knows what the heck they're doing, because the last thing that you want to do is partner with somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. They mess up a filing, it gets denied, and who bears the brunt of the consequences? It's going to be you, okay? So if your employer is saying, hey, this H-1B looks fun, I think I'll do it on my own, you might want to pump the brakes on that, because if they screw up, then it's really going to derail your entire permanent residency plan. So I'm certainly here as a resource for everybody. I've helped many people from Sacred Heart over the years, but if you don't use me, I certainly won't be offended. Just make sure, because you owe it to yourself, to use somebody who is qualified in this area, because at the end of the day, you want to get your green card, and you want to work with the right person to do it, okay? So I'm going to stick around. It was a pleasure speaking with you guys. If you have any general questions you want to ask, feel free. But otherwise, I'll stay at the front. If anyone wants to come chat with me, I'll stay around for like 10, 15 minutes, okay? Thank you so much.